In China, it is called qi. In India, it is prana for life force. And to the English-speaking world, it is simply energy. At rest, it is the potential to create, move, and act. In motion, it is kinetic. All living things rely on the transfer and transformation of energy for survival. For thousands of years, mankind has obsessed over how to acquire it, keep it, harness it, and use it. Ultimately, one source, the sun, over billions of years has delivered an almost unimaginable amount of energy. About as much energy as mankind uses today in a year reaches the Earth every hour. That tremendous energy resource has been stored under the Earth's surface in the form of carbon-based fossil fuels, and on its surface in the form of carbon-based plant and animal life. The carbon atom is the basic building block of all life. Man's mastery of energy began with plant life as the first major advance in the human understanding of energy. Using wood to cook food and heat dwellings dates back at least 400,000 years. Through many past millennia and up until very recently, wood and other forms of biomass have been the primary energy resource used by human societies. The rise and fall of societies can be linked to the dominion over wood for energy and infrastructure. During the Hellenic period, the ancient Middle East lost most of its forests by the end of the 3rd millennium BC. As a consequence, the center of trade and power in the Mediterranean shifted to Crete and the Greek world areas, as they still had sufficient reserves of timber. This allowed the rise of the great Greek Empire. Fast forward to medieval Europe, when wood was used by Britain up to the second half of the 16th century. Another energy crisis was developing as Europe was rapidly becoming deforested, and a need for a new energy source was born. Coal, easy to find and holding much more energy per unit of weight, began its rapid rise to greatness as an effective energy source, spurring on the Industrial Revolution. In the 18th century, an abundant supply of relatively easy-to-obtain coal, along with the invention of the steam engine, made this industrialization possible, thus turning the potential energy from the sun into kinetic energy. Spurred on by an ever-increasing desire for comfort, convenience, and efficiency, the search for even more effective energy sources continued, culminating in the widespread practical use of oil in the early 20th century. The invention of the internal combustion engine was the major influence in the rise of oil, displacing the steam engine because of its better energy transmission qualities and efficiency. But the conversion of oil to gasoline was not the only game in town. Michael Faraday demonstrated that electricity would flow through wire when a magnet was moved around it. This understanding is now at the center of almost all electricity generation, regardless of source. Whether by burning coal, natural gas, or using a nuclear source to make steam to drive an electric generator. Alternatively, by using hydro or wind energy that drive electrical generators directly. Faraday's discovery, along with the contributions of Nikola Tesla, Thomas Edison, and others, eventually led to the electrification of societies, further transforming and modernizing daily life for billions of people. Electricity, generated at a power plant, could be efficiently transmitted over long distances to light homes, power machines, and much more. In August of 1896, the two men most associated with growing our energy appetite met. Henry Ford, inspired by Thomas Edison, a man 16 years his senior, was experimenting with gasoline-powered engines. Edison, the father of multiple inventions and holder of an astounding 1,093 patents, was also dreaming of the horseless carriage, but saw the future in electric-driven cars. Based on the energy-carrying capability of gasoline compared to batteries of the time, the next 100 years would become dominated by Ford's vision for transportation, fueling man's dominion over distance through cars, trucks, trains, and planes. Throughout the 20th century, oil was being converted to gasoline or used as the key ingredient for what is now over 6,000 products, from cosmetics to synthetic fibers for clothing, to medicines, to food, to plastics for many commonly used products like toys. And oil grew to become the most used energy source next to coal. Finally, natural gas, the third major carbon-based energy source, arrived. Although known for centuries as a possible fuel source, extraction and containment capabilities were not broadly developed until the early 1800s. Because of its high stored energy capability, low cost, and relative ease of distribution, natural gas and gas liquids became the preferred choice for millions throughout the 20th century. Uses included heating, cooking, and producing a multitude of other products, including fertilizer to grow our crops and feed our ever-increasing global population. Today, about 22 million tons of coal, 94 million barrels of oil, and almost 10 billion cubic meters of natural gas are used each day. On an energy equivalent basis, about 37 years of stored solar energy in the form of fossil fuels. It is a large amount of energy used to improve the lives of billions of people, keeping us warm, supporting the growth of food for our tables, materials for the construction of our dwellings, power for our electronics, and fueling our transportation, which provides the freedom to move about this great planet of ours. These fossil fuels make up over 3/4 of human energy consumption, and as necessary as they are to modern life, we now believe that our almost inexhaustible thirst for more energy and an ever-increasing modernization and industrial development seems to be upsetting the delicate Earth balance of atmospheric carbon dioxide. The CO2 cycle is an amazing and integral part of how all living things on our Earth survive. All humans and animals breathe out CO2 upon oxygen conversion in our bodies. All carbon-based fossil fuels also release CO2 when burned through the process of combustion. The elegance of the system is, of course, that all plant life takes in the sun's energy and through the photosynthesis process absorbs CO2 and gives off oxygen. Fortunately for us, oxygen is what we need, and CO2 is what the plants need. The more CO2 plants get, the faster and better they grow. At times in Earth's history, CO2 levels were much higher than they are today, and plant life thrived at amazing rates. Carbon dioxide is a natural occurring molecule and a building block for all life on Earth. CO2 is an essential food source for the estimated 3 trillion trees and other plant life on our planet. Our climate has always changed and always will change. The Milankovitch cycle, named after the Serbian astronomer and mathematician who is generally credited with calculating the magnitude of the changes in the Earth's eccentricity, axial tilt, and precession. Taken in unison, variations in these 3 cycles create alterations in the seasonality of solar radiation reaching the Earth's surface. These times of increased or decreased radiation directly influence the Earth's climate system, thus impacting the advance and retreat of Earth's glaciers and guaranteeing that climate does change on Earth. When reviewing temperature variations on Earth over 65 million plus years, you find that average global temperatures have varied from over 16 degrees Celsius higher when compared to today, to a few degrees colder, and that we have been in a major cooling period. Ice ages are also an inevitable part of life on Earth due to the orbital fluctuations of Earth around the Sun, from a circular orbit to that of an ellipse, on a cycle of about 100,000 years. So over the last 650,000 years, a period of extensive study for the presence of atmospheric CO2, we have experienced multiple regular periods of major glaciation and 7 ice ages. Within the last 20,000 years, since the peak of the last major glaciation, 95% of Canada was covered in ice, over 3 kilometers thick in many places. Due to changes in the Earth's tilt from about 21.5 degrees to about 24.5 degrees over a cycle of every 41,000 years, it is likely we warm and cool, creating better situations for ice growth and retraction, depending upon where we are in the cycle. Currently, we are at about the midpoint. Seasonal changes also occurred due to precession, which is the Earth's slow wobble changes as it spins, kind of like a top when it slows. Within the next 10,500 years, summer will occur in the northern hemisphere in December and winter in July. And only 5,000 short years ago, the Sahara Desert was green. The problem is we don't live lives of thousands of years to experience the wide natural variations in climate. Nor do we really consider that more CO2 will promote plant growth and delay what will certainly be the coming of another ice age. We typically relate to our own real-time average life expectancy of 80 to 100 years. What is also well known and documented about the more recent time frame of about 650,000 years is atmospheric CO2 has generally ranged from a low of about 180 parts per million to a high of about 300 parts per million. So generally, climate scientists agree that as we now move past 400 ppm, atmospheric CO2, having accumulated 100 ppm over the last 120 years or so, we are in new, modern-day, uncharted waters. The delicate balance of CO2 to support life on Earth has been upset by something. That something seems to be human activity. The human activity that generates CO2 is the burning of fossil fuels, coal, oil, and natural gas. The further complication, however, is how small a part we actually play in the CO2 cycle. Human activity produces about 29 billion tons of CO2, which is tiny when compared to the more than approximately 850 billion tons in the atmosphere, and the 38,000 billion tons of dissolved CO2 in the oceans. Humans are generating CO2 through fossil fuel combustion, while trees and vegetation are absorbing CO2, and oceans are exchanging CO2 with the atmosphere more as they warm. As tiny a part as we may play, it still may be enough to change nature's balance of the cycle, though. Now, clearly the plants will be okay. They have seen CO2 levels 17 times that of today's. The ocean should also be okay with their 45 times as much CO2 as the atmosphere. Earth, which has an astounding 100 million billion tons or 1 quadrillion tons of carbon permanently sequestered and stored in carbonaceous rocks, will also live on. The challenge is, how adaptable to the possible, yet to be understood changes that occur, will humans be? The changes that climate models predict are increased atmospheric CO2 levels that will trap more solar heat in the atmosphere, the greenhouse effect. The Earth will warm further and result in accelerating melting of polar and glacial ice, droughts, and increased localized severe weather events. In this day and age of instant communication and rapid global event reporting, many people come to the conclusion that extreme weather events are up, as is their intensity, which has been predicted by computer simulations of climate change. If you were to do a bit of research, however, you might be surprised to discover that localized extreme weather events like hurricanes and tornadoes have decreased over the last several decades when compared to earlier parts of the 20th century. Also based upon a modest amount of research, you might also be surprised to discover that polar ice volumes have decreased a very small amount when considering the Arctic and the Antarctic together, as the former is losing ice and the latter gaining. Ocean levels are also increasing and have been doing so since reliable measurements began in the 1870s. However, this change may be accelerating. You might also be curious to note that while global average temperatures have increased about 1.1 Celsius over the last 100 years, about half of that temperature increase has occurred prior to the 1950s, which is when human-based CO2 emissions accelerated. And even though there certainly have been more warmer years since the 1970s than prior, based on the same sample set, the last 17 years have seen no increase in the average global temperature. Yet, the number of droughts very recently seems to be on the rise. One final complication of the science is that at most times in Earth's history, especially the last 600,000 years, As temperatures have gone up, CO2 increases lagged by hundreds of years, seeming to indicate increased temperature is the cause of increased CO2, not the effect. So clearly, our Earth's climate is a very complicated matter. Combining the information just described with the significant role energy has and continues to play in the human experience, it follows that many countries, especially those whose economies are closely tied to energy production, and many individuals, especially those whose livelihoods are dependent upon the fossil fuel industry, are really unsure what to make of the headlines and words some of our leaders are using. These include climate crisis, humanity is in peril, climate change is an existential threat to humanity, and no fossil fuel is a good source of fuel. I believe the vast majority of employees working in the fossil fuel-driven energy economy think about how they might continue to make a contribution to our current modern lifestyle and a future that ensures their kids inherit a world that was better than the one before, not how they might destroy the world we live in. At the same time, however, the farmer in California, faced with crippling droughts and the resultant loss of his or her farm, is also wondering what to make of the situation they find themselves in and the role climate change has. Additionally, some coastal inhabitants of our Earth are also concerned with where their home in the future will be if ocean levels continue to rise. So to these individuals, the risks seem very real and present. The principles of how humans adapt to change are pretty well understood. Human nature being what it is, we are generally very slow to change. That is, until faced with a crisis. We then have tremendous adaptation skills. We adapt quickly to change if we believe the house is on fire, so to speak. So it is not surprising that the number of pronouncements of the dire consequences of a continue to do what we are doing scenario has reached a crescendo from many media, government, and even spiritual leaders. Currently, with 1.3 billion people still living in extreme poverty, 1 billion of those children, an estimated 1.6 billion people still without the basic conveniences that electricity offers, and another 2 billion still seeking to achieve a basic level of human existence with a proper bed to sleep in, proper daily nutrition, and water every day. Or the estimated 9.6 billion people that will likely be inhabiting our Earth by 2050, that will need to be fed, watered, housed, transported, and come with a desire for a better way of life than their parents had. The focus on eliminating our primary sources of energy that power our modern life seems contrary to what is needed: more energy. The immediate challenges of a world without the many benefits that fossil fuels offer would extend far beyond current perceived and yet to be validated climate inconveniences and difficulties, most of those based upon where we have chosen to settle our populations. Imagine the crisis that would occur if we stopped using fossil fuels tomorrow. We would no longer have trucks bringing food to our stores, no electricity to light our houses and the myriad of electronic conveniences we enjoy today, and the knowledge they connect us to. Our furnaces would no longer work to heat our homes, nor would we have fresh running water in our taps. So certainly, the impacts to our lives would be broad and severe, and could also include mass civil unrest, economic collapse, and the end of modern civilization as we know it. Is it really possible for us to immediately stop the use of all fossil fuels and go back to a pre-modern era way of life? So the crisis argument can be created and debated both ways. A drive to a new and not understood future with no fossil fuels, or to a modified but better understood balance of energy sources. It is perhaps time for all to move forward together in a reasonable, thoughtful, and well-planned way. Regardless of our positions on the science of CO2 and its ultimate impact on our human way of life, We have a long history of striving to do better in all we do. And yes, we can and should do better. From the wood-fired stove for warmth, to the coal-fired steam engine driving our early machines, to the internal combustion engine driving our ever-increasing car and truck fleets, to the growing number of electric or electric hybrids available to us today, innovation and technological change have powered the last 100 years of human existence like no other time in our history. Creative minds are and will continue to work on ways to develop and use the multitude of viable energy sources available to us in more environmental, practical, and responsible ways. How about we approach our worldview with a sense of balance and by generating practical solutions? The following are 7 suggestions for a future where human-produced incremental atmospheric CO2 and other greenhouse gas levels are managed in perhaps a better way. First, as burning coal creates about 2 times the amount of CO2 when compared to burning natural gas, accelerating the phasing out of coal-fired power plants, already underway in many jurisdictions, seems to be a practical first step and the one with by far the biggest impact. It would reduce our global CO2 footprint by 7,000 million tons. Natural gas, wind, and solar power generation are all well understood alternatives. Second, as burning gasoline, a refined oil derivative, in our internal combustion engines is the source of about 70% of CO2 emitted from oil sources, there are several ways available to reduce our emissions. These include continuing to increase vehicle fleet fuel efficiency through better engine technology and accelerating the use of electric and hybrid vehicles, changing up to half of our 1 billion global car and truck fleet over the next several decades. Also, we should continue to improve and increase access to our public transportation systems. These changes could reduce global CO2 emissions by as much as another 4,000 million tons. Car manufacturers now have a variety of vehicle options, and public transit investment is getting significant attention from our governments. Third, as oil and natural gas are the primary building blocks for so many of our modern-day conveniences, and between 7 to 9% of all product is lost or released during the development and production of the resource, we need to ensure the extraction of these 2 fossil fuels occurs with zero fugitive emissions. Methane is 25 times more potent than CO2 as a greenhouse gas. Technologies and methods to achieve zero fugitive emissions are also well developed. Fourth, as natural gas is the cleanest burning fossil fuel source, leverage it more for transport, heating, and industrial production. All options are proven in use. Fifth, as high-temperature industrial processes require significant energy inputs, cement making, heavy oil extraction, for example, continue to look for ways to make the same or more with less. The optimization of energy use through advanced processing technologies is also well developed in many industrial and process industries. Sixth, as about 15% of CO2 is generated in the operation of our homes and offices, take the simple steps of recycling, consuming less, insulating more, using LED lighting, and heating and cooling to more reasonable levels. Make choices of quality over quantity, purchasing items that last and use less. And finally, the 7th suggestion is, as our forests are key to the CO2 cycle and CO2 absorption, continue to promote reforestation that offsets and grows our forests at a rate of more than 0.5% per year. As of today, about 1/3 of 1% of our forests is still being eliminated. We need to collectively continue to promote and reward the increased growth of our more than 3 trillion trees. No magic solutions, breakthrough technologies, or crisis-inducing changes are required. We have the solutions to effectively manage our CO2 impact at hand. If you combine the above suggestions on a global scale and with an economic model based on fairness and consistency of pricing for all, and approximately a 35-year phase-in period, we would return to CO2 levels of about 21,000 million tons and global consumption of about 4,000 million tons on an oil equivalent basis, or about the amount we had in the year 1990. It is achievable. Some might still say that is not enough change, and others may continue to challenge any suggested changes. After all, computer-generated climate models are predictions, and with the complexity of all the factors affecting climate, we are estimating potential outcomes. However, why take a chance of unintended consequences? Why not act in ways that guarantee the preservation of our way of life in balanced and achievable ways? We certainly have the means and capability to do this. Every one of the 7 suggestions is well understood and achievable now, with no new invention, only a commitment by all nations to moving forward fairly and consistently now. Perhaps what is required is a carbon fee, driving an enhanced economic model applied at point of production, the fossil fuel industry, and consumption, the consumer. Then use that fee to make continuous improvements in production and consumption, reinvesting and funding locally further invention and making a sustainable economy more achievable. We have one Earth. Let's do our best to care for it. We have many international trade agreements with complex methods for driving fair play across much of the industrialized world, and more coming. We need to put those agreements in use to help us achieve a level playing field and consistency for all. The industrializing world, China and India, need not be bystanders to working collectively to a balanced way of being for all, as they too are subject to global commerce and trade fundamentals. And we need to stop rewarding the governments of countries that exploit basic human rights and ignore fundamental environmental practices and exclude them from international trade and commerce. Beyond the solutions already mentioned, certainly humanity's drive for innovation will continue to surprise and delight us in ways not expected. Science fiction and pop culture continues to tantalize us with breathtaking technological achievements in the area of energy generation. Just think of Iron Man's arc reactor or the Avengers' Tetranex, and imagine new and even cleaner sources of energy yet to come. Certainly, how the sun generates its life-giving energy provides us with an amazing example of what is possible in nature, with a fusion reaction, and perhaps a clue to where invention is headed. And finally, regardless of the position we take on energy production and use, and its role in climate change in our lives, we should always be considering how our decisions and actions would impact the future. We need to make choices today that give our children and generations to come the best chance of success in their lives and the world we leave to them. So, imagine a world where we don't need a crisis to improve ourselves, but one in which the best choices arise through principles that we all agree on. After all, energy is life. Thanks for listening.